A young woman lay in childbed. In the 1600s in Scotland, that was a very dangerous place to be. So many women died giving birth, and often their babies died with them. Tragically, that's what happened to this young woman. She passed away. Her weeping husband buried the wife he loved and tried to go on with his life. But 2 years later, something happened that was so shocking, it entered the annals of folklore history. One day, the young woman who had died returned alive to their home. The story the young woman told was utterly amazing. She said that while she had been lying in childbed, beings had come and taken her away. In the bed, they had placed a living image of her, which had died and been buried. Needless to say, her husband was absolutely stunned. He knew what he had buried. Over and over, he questioned her about her history. Finally, he was convinced that this really was his wife. But where had she been for those 2 years? Her memory was vague. All she knew was that she had been taken to what she called a spacious house. It was full of light, but there were no lamps in it or other sources of illumination. She didn't know what had been done to her there. The whole time, her vision had been very dim and her mind in a fog. She could hardly see or clearly perceive anything. Then one day she had touched some kind of liquid and put it in one of her eyes. Instantly, she began to see from that eye. Realizing what she had done, the beings came quickly and blinded that eye. Not long after, she had found herself walking back home. Where was the child that was about to be born 2 years ago? Unknown. Who had kidnapped her? Well, they went by many names, and such beings came in many forms. But in Scotland in the 1600s, they were called fairies. What a bizarre story. Obviously, it was just a fantastic tale buried in the folklore of old Scotland, right? But that isn't why it was recorded for us to read. The account is in one of the most important books ever written about ancient Scottish beliefs. The title is The Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, and the author was a man named Robert Kirk. Born in 1644, Kirk was a Gaelic scholar who received a master's degree at St. Andrews. He became a pastor at a local parish where he continued his scholarly work. He was involved in the first translation of the Bible into the Gaelic language. The Commonwealth is filled with supernatural accounts given to him by people that he knew personally or that came from other reliable eyewitnesses. He wasn't collecting them as some kind of early ethnologist. He collected them to convince the increasingly skeptical world of the 17th century that the supernatural was very real. Frightening things were happening to real people. There was an unseen world out of which came beings that interacted with humans, often in terrifying ways. Robert Kirk, an extremely intelligent man, believed that the story I just told you actually happened because he had talked to eyewitnesses. Very likely today we would call the experience an alien abduction. Kirk died at just 47 years old before his book was published. It has come down to us as a classic in the field about what has been called the fairy faith. To us, fairies are works of cute fantasy. We've been programmed to think this way by Walt Disney and others, but it was not always so. If you read the original Grimm's fairy tales, they are truly grim and frightening. They have been sanitized and sweetened for us. In our bright, electrical cities, we've lost touch with the world of the night that our ancestors knew. For many of them in the British Isles and Europe, fairies represented deep fear. Nowhere is this clearer than in their great fear of the changeling, that fairies could steal your child away and leave an evil substitute. What did they think was one purpose for this? Crossbreeding. The creation of human-fairy hybrids. To modern minds, that sounds absolutely ridiculous. But perhaps we should consider a few things. Because our ancestors did not have modern education, that doesn't mean they were fools. Just as with people today, they had terrifying experiences that they could not explain. From these grew stories that placed those experiences into an established cultural context. All of it caused the exponential growth of fear, which was a major reason for the phenomena in the first place. Such manifestations have been reported down through all of history, and many of them are strikingly similar. One student of the phenomena, Bose Harrington, noted a number of similarities between fairy and alien experiences. Both involve little people. Those who saw fairies reported that they had light, changeable bodies. Modern alien reports are filled with descriptions of small, mysterious beings that can pass through walls. Modern so-called aliens travel in what are thought to be spacecrafts. Those who believe in the fairy faith described burning chariots that flew through the air and could take people away. In 1768, while on a trip, the poet Wolfgang von Goethe described seeing bright hovering lights in the sky that he called a pandemonium of will-o'-the-wisps. The same kind of hovering lights were reported in medieval times and are reported around the world today. What are these beings doing in our world? Well, one thing they've been doing is clear. In both modern and olden times, they have shown an overriding interest in sex and reproductive activity. In his book, Robert Kirk states, and I quote, "Women are yet alive who tell they were taken away when in childbed to nurse fairy children. When the child is weaned, the nurse dies or is conveyed back." End of quote. In modern abduction reports, women tell of being subjected to invasive reproductive medical procedures or being forced to have sex and bear hybrid children which are taken from them early in the pregnancy. During almost all modern encounters, people report missing time. They think only a few minutes have passed, but discover it has been hours. The same kind of missing time was reported during fairy encounters. Whole days and sometimes years would pass without the individual being aware of it. Those who met fairies described long-term after effects. While in some cases a person might receive positive gifts from such manifestations, there was always a catch. The individual wound up spending his life focusing on them, trying to please them with gifts, a definite form of worship. After some fairy encounters, people reported madness, warts, blindness, and serious skin disease. Serious physical problems are often reported from so-called alien encounters today. Modern encounters often cause paralysis. The complete loss of physical control is a common phenomenon. Victims of fairy manifestations reported what they called fairy stroke. In medieval times, people found what they called fairy rings in the woods and fields where these beings supposedly danced. In one purported UFO landing site, shrubbery had been set on fire and sand fused together. In all experiences, whether ancient or modern, strange behavior has been exhibited by these beings. Both so-called fairies and so-called aliens have done odd, disorienting things to those who meet them. Astrophysicist Jacques Vallée, who has researched the phenomena for decades and has written several books about it, believes that all the encounters throughout history to the present time are from the same source and are designed to shatter old belief systems in preparation for what he calls a shift in human consciousness. His seminal book, which I have mentioned before, Passport to Magonia, catalogs a long history of strange occurrences over thousands of years. In spite of our cartoonish 21st century view, the medieval etymology of the word fairy is the same as the word demon. In medieval use, they are synonyms. There are two other terms that were considered synonyms with fairy. They are incubus and succubus, male and female demons obsessed with sexual predation. In fact, there is a strange through line of sexual predation in many contact stories, both past and present. In the Middle Ages in England and Europe, there was a common understanding that fairy incubi and succubi were dangerous sexual predators. Stories about them abound. This one is found in a book by Richard Firth Green entitled Elf Queens and Holy Friars, Fairy Beliefs in the Medieval Church. I quote, "A certain girl, the daughter of Nicholas of Nevenon of Inglethorpe in Norfolk, in the Diocese of Norwich, has been for 5 years solicited by a certain incubus demon, as was believed. He promised her many and varied gifts if she would allow him to sleep with her, but she, utterly refusing and recoiling from him and defending her body with the sign of the cross, remained still unharmed despite many vexations. Also on one occasion, the wicked spirit led her into a certain beautiful place, where she saw many wonderful things, among them an ornate table supplied with many varieties of delicious dishes, which he invited her to eat. She was terrified, however, and invoked God's aid by crossing herself in her usual way, by which she remained free of these illusions." End of quote. There are many such stories in the records of that period, and many don't have positive endings. It's important to note that these stories were not told simply as fantastical tales for entertainment. They were told by eyewitnesses and presented as examples of the common spiritual battles being fought by real people of that day. Down through history right up to the present, there are thousands of stories of supernatural sexual assaults. In Greek mythology, the being that was worshipped as Zeus, the so-called father god, was a serial rapist. A typical story. One day Zeus, feeling rather lusty, turned himself into a swan and came to Leda, the wife of King Tyndareus. Zeus begged protection from Leda because he claimed an eagle was pursuing him. When she brought him in to protect him, Zeus attacked her. This father god did not limit his assaults to women. He enjoyed an occasional young male, such as a young man named Ganymede.
Oh.
To overcome him, he became an eagle. After that, he took Ganymede to Mount Olympus to be his cupbearer and lover. Surprisingly, his wife did not appreciate this household addition and voiced her discontent. Zeus was not the only deified rapist. Almost the entire Greek pantheon enjoyed seduced or forced sex with vulnerable humans. Now, clearly these are myths, but I contend that within all myths there are seeds of ancient memories. Could it be that in the distant past, right up to the present, powerful supernatural beings have made vulnerable humans their sexual slaves, even making them bear hybrid children? Now, that's ridiculous, totally impossible, right? Perhaps not. In the future, we're going to look much more deeply into evidence for such predation and how it may relate to a strange story in Genesis chapter 6 of the Old Testament.